Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Eli Bortz. I'm editor-in-chief at the University of Notre Dame Press, and I'm here today to moderate a discussion on identity and immigration in modern Argentina. Obviously, identity and immigration are heavy topics these days, and I'm lucky to be joined by two wonderful authors who have focused on differing aspects of this topic. And let me begin by introducing them. Jeane DeLaney is professor of history at St. Olaf College. Julia Albarracín is professor of political science at Western Illinois University and author of At the Core and in the Margins, Incorporation of Mexican Immigrants in Two Rural Midwestern Communities, published by Michigan State in 2016. Jeane DeLaney is author of this book, Identity and Nationalism in Modern Argentina, published this year by Notre Dame Press. Julia is author of Making Immigrants in Modern Argentina, also published by Notre Dame Press this summer. We had the fortunate timing of having both books released in this very strange season, and we're very happy to have this presentation available for this year's American Political Science Association's annual meeting, which is virtual, as is every other meeting. So with that being said, with all of the introductions in place, I wanted to start off the discussion by opening it up to Jeane and Julia. Obviously, they're dealing with two sides of this, this concept, this Argentine identity, this Argentine cultural construct. And so I wondered maybe if Julia would start us off by telling us a little bit about her book. Julia, would you be interested in that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the introduction, Eli. So my book is called Making Immigrants in Modern Argentina. And what I did in my work was to investigate the factors that shape immigration policy decisions. And I looked at different types of factors like economic factors, cultural and identity factors, international factors, and how those factors interact with the state decision-making process. So the book argues that even though European immigrants, right, were welcome in Argentina and are still welcome independently of the economic situation, immigrants from Latin American countries found the doors closed off for them whenever there was an economic downturn or another kind of crisis. These immigrants from Latin America were not only the ones that were discriminated against in other times during the World War II, for example. Argentina was not very open to immigrants from the Nazi-occupied countries. And, but with a few exceptions, in general, European immigrants have been welcome in Argentina, and Latin American immigrants were not. And this changed in 2003 when a new immigration law was passed that establishes that immigrants from Mercosur countries, which are Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay, and there are a number also of associate members. So those immigrants coming from these countries now have a priority to immigrate to Argentina. So this is a historical change. And I'm looking at what explains also that historical change.
So we're talking about this concept of who gets to be the newcomer, or who is accepted, right, as a newcomer. And I think, Jeane, that kind of segues perfectly into kind of discussing your book a little bit about, you know, the identity, the concept of identity, particularly nationalist identity that's at play right now in modern Argentina. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about your book?
Yes, certainly, Eli. Thank you for having us and organizing this. My work is really focusing on nationalism in Argentina, which is has been uniquely powerful in that country. Nationalism has been powerful throughout Latin America, but in Argentina, there are two very different nationalist movements, a right-wing movement and a left-wing movement. And in looking at Argentine nationalism, my focus has been on how nationalists have understood the nation or conceptualized or imagined the nation. My work is rooted in this tradition of national studies which see the nation as an imagined community. And so the question is, how have nationalists imagined the nation? How they understood who was a true Argentine, who could be, who could come, who was desirable and not desirable. And also I'm looking at a shift at the early 20th century between the notion of the nation as a primarily civic entity, a political project created by people of like-minded political ideals, to a shift in the early 20th century, in part due to mass immigration and the influence of romantic nationalism from Europe, to this more of this idea of the nation as a unitary ethnocultural community. And so I'm looking at the shift that occurred in the early 20th century and the emergence of this idea of an Argentine race. This was very much a part of discourse in the early part of the 20th century. And then how that becomes central to nationalist discourses in the post-30 period, and where the idea of race began to sort of fade away, but there was this idea of el ser nacional, or the national being, which both right-wing and left-wing nationalists argued had to be defended. And so they had very different understandings of what el ser nacional was. One was much more restricted than the other. The right wing believed that Argentina was Hispanic and Catholic. The left wing believed it included members or descendants of the immigrants who came in the early 20th century. But in both cases, they really saw the ideal of Argentina as a unitary, culturally and ethically unified nation, which had very important consequences for understanding or tolerance of cultural pluralism, the place of Jews, tolerance of Protestantism, that kind of thing. So that's, so my argument is that different ways of imagining Argentina really shaped attitudes toward both outsiders and domestic diversity.
Let's roll the clock back just a little bit and talk about the origins, the roots of all of this. You know, as much as you can or want to. You know, where did this nationalist concept come from? Where did the notion of a true Argentine, where did it emerge? How did it emerge? Who made that? Who was identified as an Argentine from the beginning? You know, at the earliest stages. How far back can we go? And this is to both of you, really. However you'd like to do it. If Jeane, you want to start off, and then
no, Julia, why don't you start, Julia?
By all means.
I can start. So I feel that the point of departure is colonization, right? And the fact that the Spanish enacted this almost castas in Latin American societies, where the Peninsulares from Spain were at the top, then followed by the Creoles, which were their descendants born in the Americas. And then at the bottom were the indigenous populations and the African populations forcefully brought from Africa. And then the mixed classes were in the middle. And I feel that that ideal kind of stuck around for a long time. And when Argentina starts debating on what kind of country we're going to be and what kind of development project we're going to have, there's a very influential group of intellectuals like Domingo Faustino Sarmiento and Juan Bautista Alberdi, who had a project to bring European immigrants in order to replace the vagrant, racially mixed races of Argentina. Before that, right after independence, right, Argentina has a series of, or a long civil war that leads to the confrontation of different factions. And on the one hand are the Unitarians, which are the more likely to be looking up to Europe. And they're the ones that want to have a model, an agricultural exports model, where the goods are going to come from the Buenos Aires area. So in any event, on the other hand, and due to the size of the Spanish Empire, there's a lot of local powers that start getting developed in different parts of the country, and the caudillos are a major force in this power center. The caudillos are by no means poor. They're people who run their haciendas and basically get along really well with their workers. Many times they're white from Spanish descent, but they managed to create a relationship, a good working relationship with their peones, right? Their farm workers that were at the time more likely to be racially mixed. And these figures are more predominant in the rural areas. So I feel that that confrontation between the unitarios and federales marked the history of Argentina, where the unitarios just want everything European and to erase those local characteristics of Argentina, and then the federales who are more in line with the nationalists that Jeane addresses in her book, which want to rescue an authentic Argentine character, right? And are more open to racially mixed populations and more toward like Spanish descendants than other European nations. The other intellectuals, Alberti and Sarmiento, wanted Northern Europeans, which we never got many of, but they wanted British citizens. They didn't like Spanish citizens either. So I think that's kind of how I see these types of ideal Argentinians developing throughout history.
And Jeane, it sounds like you sort of have the perfect segue into sort of talking a little bit more about what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I certainly agree with Julia that from the very beginning, the political powers, particularly those centered in Buenos Aires, created this ideal or embraced this ideal of Argentina as a white nation. That was absolutely fundamental, and whiteness as part of national identity is just runs through Argentine history, and it's absolutely, any Argentine will tell you that. At the same time, if we look at Argentina through the lens of how the nation is imagined, what really comes out, and this is sort of the work of Argentine scholars that Jose Carlos Chiramonte, for example, who argued that when Argentines broke with Spain, they did so not in the name of creating, of having a distinctive ethnicity, because they were Spanish, the people who participated, who were the authors of independence, but they really had a political project. And so they understood Argentina to be first and foremost a political community that meant that people, although there was a marked preference for Europeans and whiteness, that all people could become Argentines if they were loyal to the state, if they embraced the national institutions. And so there was early on a voluntaristic understanding of what it meant to be Argentine. And whiteness, because, whiteness was highly valued, but particularly in the 19th century, this idea of whiteness was pretty elastic. So that, for example, freed Blacks, people of African descent, if you're male, you become a citizen. Indigenous peoples living within the settled areas of the territory were granted citizenship. And so the project itself was to create a nation in which was sort of based on shared loyalty, political loyalties, rather than a shared ethnicity. At the same time, Julia's exactly right. This whiteness was prized, and that was just part of the racial prejudices of the era, and which of course remain with us. That those people who were white and of European descent were more likely to be those people who could best build a modern democratic nation, is what the ideal was.
Well, so compare and contrast the experience of Argentina with its neighbors, or with the Western Hemisphere, or the Americas in general. both coming from your sort of unique perspectives. How does the Argentine experience shape up? What is it? Is it unique? In the continental sense from its neighbors? Is it similar? What do you think? What's going on? What's going on here in the mix that sort of sets it apart, or in fact makes it very similar to other national experiences right now? Either one of you can pick it up from there.
Julia. Do you want to, Julia?
Julia, would you like to, take us in, Julia.
There, I'm muting myself. So, for a long time, I tried to find a country in South America or Latin America to compare with Argentina's immigration experience, but I really had a hard time, not because racism and the ideal whiteness was like prevalent, as I said before, throughout the colonial times and even after independence. But I feel like the massive project of engineering of the population that took place in Argentina is more comparable to countries like the United States, right? For example, in the U.S., the racial preferences were more obvious from the beginning, and they simply banned, for example, not in terms of immigration first, but if you look at even during the open doors era of immigration, right, there were restrictions in terms of who could become a citizen in the US. And you had to be white to become a citizen. In Argentina, we didn't have that. And as Jeane mentioned, excuse me, we did have a certain access to citizenship by the former inhabitants of the River Plate Viceroyalty. For the most part, for example, in the law, an immigrant was defined as somebody who came by ship to Argentina. So in the Constitution, the same way, for once, the Constitution says any person in the world that wants to come to Argentina can come to Argentina, but then right after that, there's an article that says that the government only encourages European immigration. So I feel that in certain ways, Argentina is more comparable with nations that did a very, very intentional, right, selection of people that they wanted as ideal citizens for their countries.
And Jeane, I would imagine that the notion of nationalist fervor, I'm sure you can find some similarities in other areas. What have you found? What did you find?
Well, first I'm thinking about the similarities and differences between Argentina and the rest of Latin America. As anyone who teaches in Latin American history or politics has to agree, you first have to justify using the whole concept of Latin America because the countries are so very different. But I think Julia and I would agree that among those differences, Argentina really does stand out. I think that this notion that she points out of this political engineering or of the population is very unique and very important. And but it's also, as we both would agree, Argentina had very few, well, it did have an indigenous settled population, but compared to Mexico, parts of Central America, Andean region, there was nothing quite like it. And another aspect of that is that when the administrative center of the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata was established in 1776, it was established in Buenos Aires, in the city of Buenos Aires, town of Buenos Aires, which was facing the Atlantic. And that was very far from the settled indigenous population, which is and was in the Northwest. So the elites of Buenos Aires really ignored the indigenous population. And so there's never been a sense that indigenous people were important in Argentina. When you think about Mexico, I mean, the whole cult of mestizaje and having an identity or a nation that has to deliberately address indigenous people and very carefully address then that that was not the case in Argentina. Indigenous peoples have always been this afterthought. And so I think this, Argentina has been very unique in that way. It's both having an attitude that they were white, and then the social engineer, the political engineering for to attract European immigrants. Now, all Latin American countries sought to attract European immigrants, but it just so happened that Argentina, at a time when immigrants were leaving Southern Europe in great numbers, Argentina had sort of a happy confluence of events where they had the great desire, or the great need for of labor. And so there were a lot of opportunities in Argentina that, say, Mexico wasn't able to provide.
Well, so you've already answered sort of the next question that was in my mind. We've already sort of discussed kind of, which groups, which communities sort of get to participate, or how they get to participate in the sort of Argentine, national experience. So I want to take it a little more generally for both of you. I want to take it back to the books, because again, they are fantastic. And I wonder if you both would sort of talk about what led you to writing these books, what led you to this topic, what surprised you as you dug into these concepts. Julia, would you like to begin? Tell me about what propelled your book, and what stood out as you were sort of working.
Okay, when I came to the US, right, I went to the University of Florida to get my PhD, and it has a very important Latin American studies program. So there are a lot of students from Latin America at the University of Florida. So my first thought was, oh great, I'm gonna have a lot in common with all these students coming from other Latin American countries. And what I found is that their stereotypes about Argentinians, some of them, based on truth, were very, very negative. And they were used to meeting Argentinians that would tell them, oh, Argentina is not like the rest of Latin America. In Argentina, we all came from ships and things of that nature. So imagine how a person, right, of maybe mestizo origin from Mexico feels when they encounter somebody from Argentina who says that. So that made me so upset, and in a way so kind of embarrassed to be Argentinian, to be negating all the, the indigenous population that we did have, not in large numbers, but we did have some. And I decided to tell the story, of what were these contradictions. At the same time, in my family, I kind of have both stories. The completely immigrant story on my mom's side. Her mom was from Spain. Her grandpa was from Italy on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
That side of the family, his family had been in Argentina, first in the Northwest, which was a lot more racially mixed, and it still is. And also they had been there for 4 centuries.
Wow.
And as they found out, excuse me, a couple of years ago, when I did 23andMe, I am 7% Native American, but I only found out this later, much later. I wish I had known before, when I was having these conversations with these Latin American students. So that was kind of what took me in this direction. I was already set with immigration, to be quite honest. I have worked for the Ministry of Interior in Argentina, and I have been, in the organism that supervised the immigration agency. And I was like very upset with a lot of injustices that I saw being done to immigrants. So I wanted to write about that. But that's what decided my theme, was that experience with other Latin American students at the University of Florida. And I'm very grateful to them for opening my eyes to that.
And as a former Gator, I'm glad to hear that someone else came out at University of Florida with good experiences. Jeane, what about you? What led you to this book? What shocked you? What's coming out for you?
Well, I don't have a personal sort of ancestral tie to Argentina. My interest in this topic really came from archival work. I was researching the early part of the 20th century because I was really interested in, this was a period of massive European immigration between 1880, 1930, over 5 million Europeans, usually, mostly from Italy and Spain, came to Argentina. And I was interested in the impact, the sort of intellectual impact of immigration. And how do people understand what was happening? Were they reacting? And so in reading sort of through the newspapers and literary journals of the time and policy journals, I was really struck by this thing I kept seeing. It was a real concern about what's happening to the raza argentina, the Argentine race. And that just hit me like, what are they talking about? And certainly race was a very elastic term during this period. It was understood in genetic biological terms, but the predominant use of that term had to do with, really was equated to ethnicity. And this notion of a national race, it struck my ears my mind so strongly. And so my project really evolved from that, because I wondered, did people in the 19th century talk about an Argentine race? And they didn't. And so I was wondering, as I read further, it became clear to me that in the 19th century, people understood the nation to be white. They wanted to be white, but it was a political project. And to be an Argentine meant to be loyal, as I mentioned before, and to embrace the Constitution, etc. So this very essentialist, romantic notion of a national race just hit me in the head like a beam. And that's really where my project took off. It was like, what caused that change? And what are the long-term consequences of that change? And so I come to this through the lens of intellectual history. So my question was, why do people think one way in one era, and what caused them to reconceptualize the nation in another era? And so I looked at, mass immigration historically has led to the rise of ethnic understandings of the nation. We see that in our own country today. Whenever we talk about the dangers of immigration, we don't use the term race, but we talk about our national culture, and that's code for white European culture. But of course, as a counter discourse, which says, we're a nation of immigrants, people come, they become part of the nation through embracing our values and our political institutions. So I'm really interested in why that transition happened. And so I really focused on the early 20th century, and then went back to the 19th century. Then I realized this discourse really gets picked up by the nationalists in the latter part, in the post-1930 period. So this project was long-standing, but it grew really organically from my asking these questions. Well, what is the impact of understanding the nation in essentialist terms? And then I looked at these nationalists, and they were using those concepts themselves and arguing. I think this is really important for Argentine politics. There's this very strong argument that it is said in Nacional that the Argentine being was hostile to liberalism. That liberalism and democracy are alien values and alien institutions, and therefore, liberalism is not for us. And so these two very anti-liberal forms of nationalism, national unity forms, but these were both very anti-liberal.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jeane, you kind of segued perfectly into the into the sort of as we kind of near the end, the long-term consequences. I wondered if you both would be willing to speak about what's Argentina like today, what's going on right now, today on the ground. How have these trends impacted? Is COVID playing a role in this? Can we detect that yet in terms of policy, in terms of approach, in terms of openness? Maybe Julio, would you like to sort of start us off? What's your sense of the state of affairs right now on the ground?
Okay, I will take it a little back pre-pandemic because in Argentina they're in such a lockdown, like extreme
Yeah.
lockdown,
Yeah.
that it's hard to evaluate what's going on right now.
Yeah.
But what I found that in recent years, we continue to resort to this stereotyping of Latin American immigrants, right? And idealizing European immigrants. I did analysis of portrayal of immigrants in the media in my book during the 80s, during the 90s, and then in the 2000s. And every time there are problems, every time the economy struggles, we go back to there's more crime, it must be the immigrants. Oh, there's drug trafficking, it's a world phenomenon. No, it must be the immigrants from Colombia that we recently admitted, right?
Mhm.
It also goes hand in hand with the government in power. And usually Peron had many problems, but in a way he was more receptive of Latin American immigrants and the migrants from the bordering provinces with other countries, right, from the interior of Argentina. But in general, except for President Menem, in general, Peronism was more receptive of immigrants from Latin American descent. And I may want to clarify, as it's the case in the US, that immigrants nowadays don't come from Europe anymore, as much as some people in Argentina would love that. They made an attempt, the last attempt was when, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, Argentina tried to attract immigrants from the East and Central Europe with not much success, but some Ukrainians and other immigrants came with a plan from the government. And that's just, I think it's a recurring topic. Like last year, no, 2 years ago now, almost paralleling the situation in the United States, when the economy was also not doing well and President Macri was in power, they started again scapegoating immigrants for crime, increased crime, for drug trafficking. Drug traffickers were the ones from Colombia, and then the ones from Africa, which is a new immigration flow that now comes to Argentina, were the ones controlling the streets and making sure that the dealers had a reach to the population. And within that context, again, after that very liberal immigration law that I mentioned from 2003, Macri administration, as I call it in the book, a la Trump, passed an executive order modifying a law passed by Congress, right? Making it easier to deport immigrants. So that's what I think on and off, we're coming back to this idea, even though there may be a share of the population that is more accepting of immigrants from Latin American countries, there's always that scapegoating of these immigrants to distract people from the real issues. Like if the economy is struggling, I don't revise my economic plan. I just say, oh no, immigrants are causing unemployment. Immigrants are taking jobs from Argentina and stuff like that. Yeah, so this administration is a Peronist administration, and the previous, Christina Kirchner is the vice president right now, and her administration was very friendly to immigrants. So I assume that at least the government, even though maybe the media will be, scapegoating immigrants for different issues, the government, I think, is going to have like policies that are friendly to immigrants from diverse origins. That's my anticipation. But the Macri administration took pride in saying Argentines come from ships. The same thing that I criticize from, the Argentines that you run on a trip. I mean, the president was saying that, completely denying, right, the racial and mixed origin that almost 60% of Argentines have. They just don't know about it, or they don't want to talk about it. But recent studies show that 60% of the population in Argentina has some sort of indigenous blood and also African blood. That is denied.
Jeane, I would imagine that that plays a role in the modern the contemporary concept of identity. Yes. What do you think? What are you detecting on the ground? These as it stands this year, last
Yeah.
year?
Well, as an historian, I will defer to
Right.
Julia to
Yeah.
more contemporary issues, but I think that one thing that comes through is the incredible power of constructs. This construct of a white Argentina, this construct, in my case, of a unitary, essentialist notion of a single ser nacional. I think these constructs are central to, or they're actually the way in which we understand our collective selves, because nations, as we know, are, as I mentioned before, are imagined communities. So how we imagine our nation is really has an enormous impact on how we decide who can become a part of the national community. I can't talk about contemporary Argentina, but I think I could take it back to the 1930s and that and how that played out during the course of nationalism in Argentina. As I mentioned before, Argentina had two strands of nationalism, both which embraced this essentialist notion of identity. But the right wing said we're all Catholic and Hispanic. The left wing said we're a unitary, single nation with a single personality, but we include the European immigrants or their descendants. And so one was, this is a much more socially inclusive vision of Argentina. And both were, of course, anti-liberal, anti-democracy. But what we see during the course of the 20th century, and Perón plays an important part here, is that sometimes these nationalists kind of make common cause, or they certainly embrace some of the same ideas. Sometimes they fight each other. Perón took from both strands. He was much more inclusive than the right-wing national who said Argentina was only Catholic, only Hispanic, because Perón did embrace people of this notion of that indigenous people could be part of the nation. But what I see happening during the post-Perón period is that we see this incredible rise of nationalism with the right wing gaining a very strong foothold in the Argentine military, which played a role in many of the military governments, which sought to try to impose this notion of Argentina as a Catholic Hispanic nation, and saw Argentina is being besieged by exotic ideologies from abroad. And the nationalist right, or the left, also had this notion that we had to develop institutions which were unique to Argentina. We can't embrace liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is a exotic ideology that would just weaken us. And so we see this play out really in the 1970s as the nationalist right and the nationalist left really go at each other. And we have the long and horrible experience of the Dirty War beginning in 1976. And after the return to democracy in '83, I do think we see some loosening of or attempts to dislodge this notion of Argentina as a unitary sort of nation, that there's room for pluralism. We began to see some sense that some changes where indigenous languages are now recognized, that it's okay to not be Catholic, that Argentina, as all nations are multicultural and multi-ethnic, and a more dynamic notion of the national culture. It's not one thing that's unitary, enduring, and homogenous, but there's room for different kinds of people. We see this really in the treatment of Jews after the bombings of the Israeli center and Israeli embassy, where Jews can be Jews, but they can, as well as Argentine, and that Argentines are saying that, yes, Jews can be a legitimate part of our nation. Mm-hmm. So I'm a little hopeful in that this old essentialism is kind of fading away. But going back to Julia's position, yes, every time there's an economic problem, let's blame it on the immigrants. and the dark immigrants too.
Indeed.
I think I haven't been to Argentina in a few years, but I think Trump's has really given Bolsonaro in Brazil and Macri and gave Macri in Argentina sort of license to embrace this notion that immigrants are contaminants, particularly dark immigrants.
Wow. Well, both of you, believe me when I say that there are fewer jobs as daunting as tackling immigration policy, national immigration policy in any nation, or national identity in any nation, but you both have done splendidly. Any closing thoughts? I wanted to introduce the books again, just to sort of, put it on people's radars. Please, anything that you would like to wrap up with? Either of you, please. About the books or anything.
Well, I'll just say, as an historian, it's an honor to be at the Association of Political Scientists. I've never done this before, and I appreciate. I haven't had a chance to read Julia's book. I'm really looking forward to it. It just came out, and it has been a real pleasure. Thank you.
I would like to say also to the political scientists out there that works on institutions, that my book spends a big chunk of time and pages discussing the immigration policies of Congress and how, in a way, even if Congress had an inability to pass immigration, comprehensive immigration reform, as we call it in the US for a long time, they managed to exert their power by different mechanisms. And so, the weak Congress that sometimes we talk about when it comes to institutions in Latin America, and in particular in Argentina, is not always the case, at least not in immigration policy, aspect of the policy.
Very good.
Could I add something to this? I mean, Julia just sort of sparked some ideas.
Please.
Which has to do with our own country today. And then I think that what we see in our society is a real tension between the Stephen Miller notion of the United States as a European white nation, and we see this with Steve Bannon as well, with a cultural and ethnic heritage to defend. We see it with the Boogaloo Boys, all kinds of white pride, and that is as we become a more multicultural nation, we see this white reaction. We need to defend this heritage that defines us. But we have that counter discourse that we are not defined by that heritage. We're defined by a set of ideas and a set of political loyalties and an embrace of this notion that we are people who are not bound by ethnicity, but by our common loyalties and embrace of our Constitution. And that tension has always been part of our national story. And I think it's brought to the forefront today, not so much because of immigration, but because of the discourse of immigration, because we don't really have that much immigration.
Indeed.
But so I think that our national identity is in play right now. And it's very important to be attentive to where these discourses come from.
And with that, I couldn't agree more. The books are Identity and Nationalism in Modern Argentina, Defending the True Nation by Jeane DeLaney, and Making Immigrants in Modern Argentina by Julia Albarracín. Thank you both so much for this conversation. And we will see how the rest of the year unfolds. But I want to thank you both, and I want to thank the American Political Science Association for allowing us to host this event. Best wishes for a good event, and we hope to see everyone in person next year in 2021. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Eli.